The night I truly began to see my daughter's fiance for who he was started out innocently enough. Emily had been glowing all week, talking about how excited she was for me to finally sit down with Brandon over a proper dinner. She said it with the kind of hopeful insistence daughters use when they're trying to bridge two worlds: her old life with me, her father, and her new one with the man she intended to marry. I put on a pressed shirt and a jacket that had been hanging untouched in my closet for months. I wasn't a man of show anymore. Retirement had slowed me, softened my rhythms. My days were quiet, my meals simple, and my pleasures small. I suspected that was part of what worried Emily, that I would seem too quiet, too modest, too unremarkable beside the sharp young man she was so proud of. The restaurant was one of those Seaport District places, Harbor View Bistro, all polished glass and brushed steel, with lighting so carefully designed that every table seemed like a stage. I arrived a little early, letting the hostess lead me to a small corner table by the window. The harbor lights shimmered outside expensive boats bobbing in the dark water, while inside the hum of business dinners and celebrations filled the air. It wasn't my kind of place, but I told myself it didn't need to be. Tonight was about Emily. They came in together, Emily radiant even in a simple dress, Brandon with that smooth confidence that announces itself before he speaks. He shook my hand firmly, eyes flicking down to my jacket, as if he were assessing not just my grip, but my wardrobe, my worth. That look was brief practiced, but I noticed it. I notice everything. When the waiter came, Brandon took control quickly. He ordered a bottle of wine without consulting us, rattled off his choice of salmon with truffle risotto, and mentioned to the server in a loud aside that he'd just come from another late meeting at North Star. He seemed to savor the way the company name rolled into the air, as if it carried a prestige he expected the room to recognize. Emily followed his lead, gently ordering roasted chicken. When it came to me, I kept it simple. Soup and sandwich combo, I told the waiter. The special. Brandon's eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly, and Emily flushed pink, embarrassed on my behalf. She leaned toward me, voice soft, reminding me this was supposed to be celebratory, as though soup and bread weren't enough to honor her engagement. I smiled at her, assuring her it was fine. But Brandon couldn't resist. He waved his hand as though excusing me, saying with mock graciousness that he understood everyone has different budgets. That word landed with a sting sharper than the wine's first sip. Budgets. He assumed I couldn't afford salmon, assumed my choice was born of lack rather than preference. I swallowed the insult, quietly spooned up my tomato bisque, and let him talk. He talked about North Star Logic, the AI firm where he was a senior sales manager. He boasted about how he'd increased his department's numbers by 40% in 3 years, how he worked 60-hour weeks, how he planned to be a regional manager before long. Success requires sacrifice, he said, with the air of someone pronouncing a universal law. His words dripped with self-importance, a man mistaking ambition for wisdom. Emily tried to soften the edges, touching his arm, smiling at me as if to say, "Please, Dad, don't take this the wrong way." But it was impossible to miss the way Brandon looked at me like an old relic, polite enough to humor, harmless enough to ignore. The conversation turned to me. He asked what field I'd worked in, and I answered simply business. Nothing special. Emily rushed in with her usual correction, saying I was being modest, but Brandon nodded as though he understood everything in that single word. Business. In his eyes, I was a man whose career was over, whose relevance had passed, whose worth could now be measured in hobbies and health statistics. At your age, he said, the important thing is to stay busy, right? Keep healthy, keep occupied. He meant it kindly, I think, but condescension is a kind of poison, even when wrapped in politeness. I let him lecture. I let him tell me that people my age get stuck in patterns, that the business world rewards disruption, that experience without adaptation is dead weight. He said it all with that smug certainty of youth, not realizing he was describing the very company I had helped build brick by brick, line of code by line of code, through nights longer than his entire work week. He spoke of founders as if they'd been lucky stumbling into success, while he, Brandon Carter, was the one doing the real work now. I listened. I watched. I let him believe his narrative, but inside something shifted. His words scraped against 30 years of effort, against scars I carried from risks taken when nothing was guaranteed, against the knowledge of what it had cost me to give Emily the life she'd had. When the check came, I pulled out my wallet and laid down 2 20s. enough for my meal and a generous tip. Brandon looked startled, perhaps embarrassed that I insisted on paying my portion. I stood smoothing my jacket, thanking them both for dinner, for the career advice. Emily half rose her face tight with worry, whispering that I didn't need to leave early. But I did. I needed air. The drive back to Somerville was quiet, the city lights passing in soft streaks. Anger had already cooled into something sharper, more dangerous resolve. I thought of every word Brandon had said: dead weight, lucky founders, limitations of age. They echoed in my mind with each mile, but not as wounds, as fuel. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the plan was forming precise and deliberate. I would let him continue underestimating me. I would let him parade his shallow victories, let him treat me as a charity case, let him dismiss me to my daughter, his colleagues, anyone who would listen. And when the moment was right, when the audience was large enough and the stage perfectly set, I would reveal the truth. Not out of spite, not out of vengeance, but to protect Emily, to ensure she saw clearly and without illusion the man she was marrying. A man who respected only titles and paychecks, who measured worth by entrees and cufflinks, who believed age was a limitation rather than a library of experience. That night, as I sat in my study surrounded by the quiet weight of history awards, photographs, and corporation papers, I knew exactly how the story would end. Brandon Carter wanted to teach me about ambition. I would teach him about character. My study has always been more than a room. It is a vault, a shrine, and sometimes a mirror. On nights like the one after that dinner at Harbor View Bistro, it becomes a place of reckoning. I closed the door behind me, shutting out the quiet hum of my modest Somerville street, and let my eyes travel over the walls. The room is not large. 2 windows look out onto the side yard where ivy creeps stubbornly along the fence. The shelves sag under the weight of booksbinders and boxes of old notes. But what matters most are the framed pieces carefully chosen and deliberately hidden from casual visitors. They tell a story that Brandon Carter has no idea exists. On the wall opposite my desk hangs the original incorporation document for North Star Logic, signed in 1996. My name and Elliot Rains are etched there in precise ink, the birth certificate of a company that has since grown into an empire of data and algorithms. Below it, a photograph of 2 men in their 30s, me and Elliot, grinning inside a converted garage in Cambridge, surrounded by outdated computers and pizza boxes. We look exhausted and exhilarated, the way only men with a dream larger than their bank accounts can look. Next to that hangs a plaque from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, honoring us for contributions to applied artificial intelligence. To anyone else, it might seem an academic curiosity. To me, it is a reminder of sleepless nights when I doubted every line of code I wrote, every risk I took. There are more clippings from Forbes and Wired photographs, from product launches, a framed certificate marking the first patent I filed. Taken together, the collection is a mosaic of effort and persistence, not luck, as Brandon so carelessly suggested. Blood, sweat, years traded for progress. I sat in the leather chair that has molded itself to my frame over decades and stared at those reminders. Brandon's words echoed again, dead weight, outdated limitations of age. It was almost laughable. And yet, if I had revealed this wall to him, he would not have seen it. Not truly. He would have nodded politely, maybe even offered a shallow compliment, but he would not have grasped the weight behind each artifact. Respect for him only flows upward. My phone buzzed on the desk. Elliot's name lit the screen. I answered quickly, as I always do with him. How was dinner with the future son-in-law? He asked, his voice warm with amusement. Enlightening, I said carefully. Ah, one of those. I could hear him chuckle. Everything running smoothly here, same chaos as always when you're not around. Quarterly reports look strong. Any chance of ending your retirement experiment soon? I leaned back, letting his words wash over me. Retirement experiment. That was how he saw it, me stepping back, letting him shoulder the day-to-day battles. He wasn't wrong, but I had needed distance, space to breathe after decades of constant strain. Not yet, I told him. Well, enjoy it while you can. By the way, that young hotshot in sales, Brandon Carter, you've heard the name, he's been making noise. Wants more responsibility. Talks about modernization disrupting old paradigms. The phrase froze me. Disrupting paradigms. It was the same language he had used across the table from me just hours earlier. What kind of disruption, I asked. Oh, the usual. Complains about senior staff being slow talks about replacing them with hungrier young talent. The board likes his energy, but it makes me uneasy. Ambition's fine, arrogance isn't. Elliot sighed. I can't decide if the kid wants to build something or burn something down. Maybe both, I murmured. Could be. Anyway, his numbers are good, so I can't argue too much. But I miss having you here to balance things. You remember why we started this company. Sometimes I think the young ones forget. I remember, I said softly. Better than they realize. After we hung up, I sat staring at the garage photograph on my desk, Elliot and I grinning like fools. We had built something from scraps fueled by stubbornness and belief. And now this man, this boy, really wanted to disrupt it without ever knowing what it had cost to create. I opened my laptop and pulled up the most recent financials. Annual revenue nearing $220 million. 900 employees spread across 4 states. Systems and products used by corporations and universities across the country. It wasn't just numbers. It was proof of endurance. 30 years of adaptation, reinvention, and survival through downturns, competition, and endless change. Lucky. That was the word Brandon had used. Lucky. I let the word sit. Then I pushed it aside. Anger has its place, but planning requires clarity. On a yellow legal pad, I began to jot notes. Not about revenge, not even about humiliation, about lessons. Brandon needed to learn what respect truly meant, and Emily needed to see the truth before her future became a cage. First note, do not reveal identity until the right audience is present. Second note, observe behavior over time. Give him rope. Third note, prepare visible symbols for the reveal suit cufflinks gift. Fourth note, protect Emily at all costs. The lesson is for him, not her. I set down the pen, folded the pad closed, and felt the calm satisfaction of a man who has chosen his path. The months ahead would require patience, but patience had always been my weapon. Brandon thought experience was stagnation. He would learn that experience, when wielded deliberately, could be the sharpest blade of all. I switched off the lamp, leaving the study in shadow, the framed memories glowing faintly in the moonlight. On the way upstairs, I passed Emily's old room. The door stood half open just as she had left it years ago. I paused, hand resting on the frame, remembering nights I had checked on her while she slept, the little girl who had grown into the woman, now preparing to marry a man who did not yet deserve her. That was what this was really about. Not me. Not ego. Emily, protecting her even if it meant she hated me for it. I closed her door gently and climbed the stairs. In the silence of my room, I felt the weight of what was coming. A storm was brewing, but storms cleanse as much as they destroy. Brandon Carter had given me 4 careless words, dead weight, lucky limitations, outdated. In return, I would give him a lesson he would never forget. Spring in Somerville has a way of softening even the hardest thoughts. The snow gives way to damp soil buds appear along branches that seemed dead a week before, and the air carries that faint sweetness of renewal. I spent one Saturday morning kneeling in my backyard working the soil around the tomato plants I'd set in neat rows. Gardening had become my therapy in retirement, a small, steady reminder that patience yields fruit. That was when Emily arrived, her car pulling into the driveway with the urgency of a woman carrying more questions than answers. She came through the side gate without knocking, as she had all her life, and stopped at the edge of the garden. She stood there, arms crossed, watching me press mulch around the plants. "Dad," she said finally. I looked up, brushing dirt from my gloves. Her tone was different, firm, edged with something between suspicion and worry. I gestured to the bench under the maple tree, the one I'd built last summer from salvaged wood. She sat smoothing her skirt as though gathering courage. "What are you planning?" she asked. I eased myself onto the bench beside her, letting the question hang in the air. It wasn't really a question. It was an accusation. She knew me too well to think I'd left that dinner with Brandon without a storm brewing inside me. "Planning," I echoed, keeping my voice mild. She didn't look away. Her eyes were sharp, the same deep hazel that once begged for bedtime stories, now demanding answers. "Don't play games, Dad. I've known you my entire life. You're up to something, and it involves Brandon." I considered denying it, but Emily had always had a gift for sensing the truths I tried to hide. Instead, I leaned back and studied her. The sunlight caught her engagement ring, scattering flecks of brightness across the garden dirt. "Sweetheart," I said quietly, "sometimes people need time to show their true nature." Her brow furrowed. "What does that mean?" It means I continue choosing each word carefully, that assumptions reveal more about a person than facts ever could. Brandon assumes he knows who I am, what I'm worth. He hasn't bothered to ask. That tells me everything I need to know. Emily's shoulders slumped, the tension in her posture breaking into frustration. Why won't you just tell him? Why are you letting him think you're some unemployed old man? Why lie? Not lying, I corrected gently, just not volunteering information. To me, that's the same thing, she pressed. I looked at her hand, small, elegant, now adorned with a diamond that caught the sun like fire. Has Brandon ever asked about my life? Really asked not just surface questions, but with genuine curiosity. Her lips parted, then closed again. We both knew the answer. Brandon hadn't asked. He had assumed, filled in the blanks with his own narrative, and carried on as though my history were irrelevant. Emily's voice cracked slightly. It's not fair, Dad. He doesn't know he's being tested. Life isn't fair, I replied. We're judged every day on appearances, on surface impressions. The question is, what kind of man does Brandon become when he thinks he has the upper hand? Through the sliding glass door, I could see him inside my house. He had wandered to the dining table where Emily had left a stack of seating charts. He stood there, phone to his ear, gesturing as he spoke, as though orchestrating a corporate takeover rather than arranging chairs for a wedding. Even his posture radiated performance. I turned back to Emily. You saw how he treated me at dinner. The condescension, the unsolicited advice, the dismissal of anyone he thinks is beneath him. Is that the man you want to spend your life with? She was silent, her eyes fixed on the dirt at her feet. Finally, she whispered, He's not always like that. When we're alone, he's different. Kinder. I'm sure he is, I said softly. But character isn't what we do when it's easy. It's what we do when we think no one important is watching. Emily blinked back tears, her voice rising with a mixture of anger and fear. So you're preparing some kind of lesson for him. What happens at the wedding when he finds out you'll humiliate him, humiliate me? I reached for her hand, covering it with mine. I'm not trying to sabotage your happiness. I'm trying to protect it. Better to see his true character now than discover it 5 years into marriage when the stakes are higher and the wounds deeper. Her gaze softened, though the lines of worry remained. You want me to keep this secret until then? I want you to watch him, I said firmly. Watch how he treats people he thinks don't matter. Watch how he talks about respect, about success, about worth, and then decide for yourself what kind of life you want. She twisted the engagement ring slowly around her finger as though testing its weight. And if I decide he's exactly who I thought he was, then I'll dance at your wedding and welcome him into the family with joy. I meant it, every word, but I also knew that possibility was slim. Emily rose from the bench, brushing dirt from her skirt. Through the glass door, Brandon ended his call and looked around impatiently, clearly wondering what was taking so long. She glanced toward him, then back at me. He's going to hate you when he finds out, she said quietly. Probably, I admitted. The real question is whether he'll hate himself for how he's treated me. She stood there a moment longer, then nodded reluctantly. Okay, Dad, I'll keep your secret, but promise me you're not doing this just for revenge. I stood and kissed her forehead, the way I had since she was a child. Everything I'm doing is because I love you. Her eyes shimmered full of conflict before she turned toward the house. Brandon tapped his watch as she entered, his impatience visible even from where I stood. Emily smiled at him, but I saw the hesitation in her step. She was beginning to see, even if she didn't want to admit it. When they left a few minutes later, Brandon shook my hand stiffly, offering a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Emily hugged me quickly, whispering, Be gentle with him, Dad. I watched them walk to his car, sleek and black gleaming in the sun. He adjusted his cuff as he opened the door, already back in performance mode. Emily slid into the passenger seat, her shoulders tense, her smile faint. The engine roared to life, and they pulled away, leaving me alone in the garden. I looked down at the tomato plants, their fragile stems trembling in the breeze. They would need weeks of care before they bore fruit. Patience, I reminded myself. Lessons that matter take time. Brandon Carter was about to learn one. Time has a way of stretching and compressing depending on what you're waiting for. In the 4 months between that garden conversation and the wedding, I lived 2 lives. On the surface, I was the picture of quiet retirement. Beneath it, I was laying the groundwork for a lesson I hoped my daughter's fiance would never forget. Each morning began the same coffee on the porch newspaper, folded neatly on my lap, the low hum of Somerville traffic drifting over the hedges. Neighbors waved as they walked their dogs. Some stopped to chat about the weather or the Red Sox. I cultivated the image of the harmless retiree content, with small routines far removed from the fast-moving world of business. If Brandon happened to drive by, or if Emily mentioned me, I wanted the picture consistent. An old man with dirt on his hands, and not much else. Brandon called me occasionally, always under the guise of checking in. He'd ask whether I'd considered volunteering at the library or taking up golf. His voice carried that professional courtesy reserved for clients you humor but don't respect. He'd slip in mentions of his workload, his sales numbers, his latest strategies. I let him talk. I never challenged his boasts. The more rope, the better. Emily, true to her promise, stayed quiet, but I could hear the strain in her voice during our phone calls. She wanted to believe in him, yet doubt had begun to gnaw at her edges. She'd ask me if I was lonely, if I regretted retiring. I answered truthfully that solitude was easier to bear than false company. She never pushed, but I knew she was watching Brandon carefully, just as I'd asked. Meanwhile, I began preparing the tools of my lesson. They weren't weapons in the traditional sense, but symbols, small, deliberate pieces of truth that would speak louder than any confrontation. The first was the suit. I visited Armando's a tailor on Newbury Street who had dressed Boston politicians for decades. He measured me carefully, his tape sliding across shoulders that had borne more weight than he knew. I chose charcoal gray, a fabric understated but undeniably fine. Armando nodded approvingly, promising it would emphasize dignity without shouting about wealth. That was exactly the point. The second was the cufflinks, platinum with the North Star logo etched in miniature diamonds. They had been a commemorative gift years ago, tucked away in a velvet box in my desk drawer. I brought them out, polished them until they caught the light like stars, and placed them beside the suit. They were subtle, but anyone from the company would recognize them instantly. The third was the gift. I visited my banker, Jonathan Pierce, whose office overlooked the glimmering sweep of Boston Harbor. He raised an eyebrow when I requested a certified check for $75,000. "That's a generous wedding gift, even for you," he said. I signed the papers without hesitation. It wasn't about generosity. It was about unmistakable evidence. Numbers Brandon couldn't dismiss as budget choices. During those months, I also perfected the persona of the unremarkable retiree. I drove my aging sedan to the grocery store, made a point of being seen clipping coupons, and wore cardigans that had faded at the elbows. Brandon visited once or twice with Emily, his eyes scanning my modest house with polite disappointment. He made comments about resale value, about how these older neighborhoods don't hold up well. I smiled, nodded, and offered him iced tea. Let him think he was the one with insight. Every careless word he spoke, every dismissive gesture I cataloged silently. He talked about dead weight in companies, about older folks clinging to irrelevant methods. He laughed about colleagues who coasted until retirement. He never realized he was handing me the very evidence I needed. Sometimes late at night, doubt would creep in. Was I being cruel? Was I orchestrating something too heavy-handed for my daughter's wedding day? But then I would remember his voice at that first dinner, dripping with condescension, and Emily's worried expression in the garden. The lesson wasn't for me. It was for her. Better she see his true nature now than discover it years later when promises had hardened into regrets. The weeks slipped into months, and soon the invitations were mailed. An elegant cream envelope arrived in my mailbox one afternoon, Emily's handwriting scrawled lovingly across the corner. I opened it at the kitchen table, running my fingers over the embossed lettering. June 15th, the Cliffside Pavilion, Nantucket, a setting as polished and expensive as Brandon's ambition. A few days later, Emily and Brandon visited to hand-deliver a copy. Brandon stood in my living room, his gaze sweeping over the furniture and framed photos, with that faint sneer he tried to disguise as polite interest. He mentioned that his boss, Elliot, would be attending along with several board members. He emphasized how important first impressions would be, especially with men like Elliot. He suggested ever so gently that I might consider upgrading my suit for the occasion. I assured him I had it covered. He didn't believe me. Emily lingered in the garden afterward, her fingers trailing along the tomato plants. "Promise me you'll be careful," she whispered. I promised. She didn't ask more. By late May, the pieces were all in place. The suit was finished, tailored to perfection. The cufflinks gleamed in their box. The certified check rested in my desk drawer, crisp and undeniable. All I had to do was wait. Patience had always been my ally. In business, in parenting, in life, seeds take time to bear fruit. Lessons take time to settle. Brandon Carter thought he was climbing toward power, stepping over dead weight as he went. He had no idea he was walking straight into the most important lesson of his life. The days grew longer, the garden greener, and the air warmer. June approached, carrying with it both celebration and reckoning. And I, the invisible man in my own daughter's story, was ready to step back into the light. Nantucket has a way of making people feel important. The ferry ride over smooth waters, the ocean breeze that smells faintly of salt and money, the rows of shingled houses that whisper of generations of wealth, it all conspires to convince visitors they're part of something exclusive. That was precisely why Brandon chose the Cliffside Pavilion for the wedding. He wanted the place to speak for him before he even opened his mouth. I arrived the evening before driving my old sedan off the ferry while sleek black SUVs rolled past me toward the resort. Nobody noticed me, which was exactly the way I wanted it. To them, I was just another guest, perhaps a distant uncle, certainly not someone of consequence. The rehearsal was held in a small chapel adjacent to the pavilion, a space of polished wood and stained glass that smelled faintly of lilies and candle wax. I walked in quietly, taking a seat near the back. Emily stood at the altar in a pale rehearsal dress, her hair pinned loosely, her nervous energy barely disguised. She smiled when she saw me, but I recognized the tension in her shoulders. Brandon was surrounded by colleagues from North Star young men and women dressed with calculated precision. They spoke in clusters, voices low and self-assured, glancing at their phones between directions from the wedding planner. Brandon stood at the center of them, adjusting his tie, the undisputed star of his own stage. When he noticed me, his smile widened, not with warmth, but with performance. He raised his voice just enough for his colleagues to hear. "Everyone, this is Emily's father, Martin Hale. He's retired now, lives modestly in Somerville." The words were delivered smoothly, like a practiced elevator pitch, but I caught the faint glimmer in his eyes. He wanted to establish the hierarchy himself, the rising executive me, the irrelevant retiree. I shook hands with a few of his colleagues, accepted their polite smiles, and returned to my seat. They looked at me the way one might glance at a landscape painting in a hallway, pleasant but unremarkable. Brandon carried on explaining seating arrangements with the enthusiasm of a man conducting a corporate strategy session. He talked about optics, about making sure Elliot had a prominent spot, about how impressions mattered. Every word was aimed at demonstrating his professionalism to the colleagues, who would no doubt report back to the office. I sat quietly listening, my jaw tightening, when he gestured vaguely toward me. Dad has simple tastes. Different generations, different expectations. His colleagues chuckled politely. I stared at the stained glass above the altar, letting the words slide over me like cold rain. When there was a pause, I rose and approached him. My voice was low, but my tone carried enough steel to cut through his performance. "Be careful with judgments," I said. He laughed a little too loudly. "Mr. Hale, you don't need to lecture me about people. Reading character is my job. It's essential in sales." I let the silence stretch, watching his confidence bounce off my calm like waves against stone. "We'll see," I said simply. The words landed heavier than he expected. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but the audience was watching, so he rallied, straightening his shoulders and gesturing back toward the pews. "The point is," he continued, "success leaves clear indicators. How someone dresses, where they live, what they drive. Those things reveal priorities and capabilities. That's how you read people." Interesting theory, I thought, one he was about to test in the harshest light possible. Nancy, the wedding planner, tried to shift the focus back to the ceremony. Emily moved closer, her eyes searching mine, silently begging me not to escalate. I gave her the smallest nod of reassurance and returned to my seat. But Brandon wasn't finished. The presence of his colleagues fueled him, emboldening his arrogance. He raised his voice, directing it more toward them than to me. "Character shows and choices. Take Elliot, for example. Every decision he's made reflects excellence. You can spot his quality from across a room. That's earned respect." Earned respect. I thought of Elliot and me in that cramped Cambridge garage living off pizza and sleeping on the floor, fighting for every scrap of funding writing code until our eyes blurred. Respect wasn't earned across a room. It was earned in the trenches through years of sacrifice that Brandon couldn't begin to imagine. Emily stepped between us, her hand brushing Brandon's arm. Maybe we should focus on tomorrow's ceremony. But Brandon pressed on, basking in the attention. The truth is, some people choose comfort over achievement. And that's fine. But you can't compare it to ambition. His eyes flicked toward me for just a moment, sharp as a blade. The insult was precise, designed to wound without leaving a mark his colleagues would notice. Comfort over achievement. I stood again, slower this time, every movement deliberate. The chapel fell quiet, the murmur of conversations dimming as people sensed the tension thickening. I buttoned my jacket, the motion steady, controlled. "You're right about one thing, Brandon," I said, my voice carrying just enough to reach the back pews. "Character does show in choices." He smiled, relieved that I seemed to agree. "Exactly my point." "Tomorrow," I continued, "you'll have several opportunities to demonstrate yours." His smile faltered, confusion flickering across his face. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means assumptions can be expensive," I replied. The words fell into the hush like stones dropped into water, ripples spreading outward. His colleagues shifted uneasily, glancing between us. Emily looked stricken, torn between loyalty to her fiancé and recognition of what she'd just witnessed. I turned, walking toward the chapel doors with measured steps. Behind me, I heard Brandon's voice, sharper now, trying to reclaim control. "Mr. Hale, I don't appreciate cryptic warnings." I paused at the door, glancing back. "Enjoy your rehearsal," I said. "Tomorrow promises to be memorable." And then I left the heavy wooden door closing softly behind me. The hotel lobby gleamed under crystal chandeliers as I crossed to the exit. Guests milled about, oblivious to the storm brewing in the small chapel. Outside, the Nantucket evening air was cool and salty, grounding me after the suffocating tension. I walked slowly to my car, the old sedan parked among gleaming rentals and luxury vehicles. I sat behind the wheel for a moment, staring back at the chapel windows. I could see figures moving inside, Brandon gesturing animatedly, Emily watching the door where I had disappeared, his colleagues exchanging looks. He thought my departure was a retreat. He would frame it that way, for them, no doubt an old man too fragile to handle a little truth. Let him. Tomorrow, the fragile one would not be me. The drive back to my rented room was quiet. The road lit only by the headlights of passing cars and the glow of the lighthouse in the distance. I thought of Elliot, unaware of the role he would soon play. I thought of Emily, wrestling with the knowledge of who her fiancé really was. And I thought of Brandon, so certain he had mastered the art of reading character. Tomorrow he would discover how wrong he was. The morning of the wedding broke clean and bright, the kind of day planners dream about but can never guarantee. The sky stretched pale blue over the island, unbroken by clouds, while the ocean gleamed like polished glass beyond the dunes. Nantucket seemed determined to provide perfection. I rose early, as I always do, long before most guests stirred from their hotel rooms. In the quiet of dawn, I laid out my suit. The charcoal gray fabric caught the light with understated elegance, neither flashy nor plain, simply correct. I fastened the North Star cufflinks with careful hands. They were cool to the touch, small but potent, silent emblems of 3 decades of sweat and sacrifice. Looking into the mirror, I saw not just an older man preparing for his daughter's wedding, but a founder stepping back onto a stage he had left willingly. Retirement had softened the edges of my days, but it hadn't erased the foundation I had built. Today, I would remind them all, especially Brandon, that respect is not granted by youth money or titles. It is earned, and it endures. I tucked the certified check into my inside pocket. $75,000. Crisp, undeniable, and more eloquent than any speech. I didn't intend to brandish it immediately, but when the time came, it would be their proof that my supposed budget choices were nothing but camouflage. By late morning, the cliffside pavilion was humming with activity. Florists moved quickly, adjusting bouquets of white roses. Musicians tuned their instruments. Guests drifted in, laughing and chatting, their bright attire a splash of color against the pale wood of the chapel. The air smelled of salt and blossoms, a heady mixture of nature and design. I took my place near the entrance, ready for my role, the father of the bride, a role so simple in words so heavy in meaning. Then Emily appeared. She stood at the top of the aisle, radiant in her grandmother's restored wedding dress. The lace had been carefully mended, the satin cleaned to a gentle sheen. She looked breathtaking, not because of the dress, though it was beautiful, but because she carried herself with a blend of nerves, joy, and determination that only a bride can hold. She slipped her arm through mine, and for a moment, all the tension, all the planning, all the quiet anger of the past months dissolved. It was just me and my daughter, as it had been countless times before, when I walked her to kindergarten, when I steadied her bike, when I guided her through heartbreaks. My chest ached with pride and love. "You look beautiful," I whispered. "Thank you, Dad," she replied, her voice trembling. The music began soft and reverent. We walked together, step by measured step, down the aisle. Guests rose in unison, a sea of faces turning toward us. I kept my gaze steady, fixed on the man waiting at the altar. Brandon stood tall in his tuxedo confidence, radiating from every angle. His eyes softened briefly when he looked at Emily, but when they shifted to me, they hardened again, as though he had not forgotten last night's exchange. Behind him, Elliot sat in the front row, distinguished in navy, his expression politely curious. He saw me as a stranger, a guest of little importance. That would change soon enough. At the altar, the officiant asked the traditional question, "Who gives this woman in marriage?" "I do," I said clearly, my voice carrying through the chapel, "her father with great love and hope for her happiness." I placed Emily's hand in Brandon's and kissed her cheek. For an instant, I lingered, my lips brushing her skin, as though I could still protect her from everything ahead. Then I stepped aside, taking my seat in the front row, my heart a storm of pride and unease. The ceremony unfolded with solemn grace. Vows were exchanged, words of love and commitment spoken with sincerity. Whatever else might be said of Brandon, his devotion to Emily in that moment seemed genuine. I watched them promise forever, and a part of me prayed he would grow into those words, that today might be a turning point rather than an unveiling. But the other part of me knew better. Lessons cannot be avoided. They must be lived. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife, and Brandon kissed Emily with theatrical passion. Applause erupted, filling the chapel with sound. Bells rang outside, timed perfectly, as though the island itself celebrated their union. As they walked back down the aisle together, Brandon's eyes flicked toward Elliot, a satisfied gleam in his expression. He believed the performance was complete. He believed he had managed the risk of me, the unimpressive father-in-law, and emerged unscathed. The receiving line formed in the vestibule. Guests offered their congratulations, their compliments on the ceremony, their admiration of Emily's dress. Brandon shook hands, Emily hugged, and I stood beside them, offering polite smiles. Then I saw Elliot rising from his seat, approaching with the measured pace of a man used to commanding rooms. My pulse quickened, not with fear, but with anticipation. The moment was drawing near. "Congratulations, my dear," Elliot said warmly to Emily, taking her hands. "Brandon speaks of you constantly." "Thank you, Mr. Raines," she replied, her smile genuine but tight. Brandon's chest swelled with pride. He gestured toward me, his voice lowering into that familiar, dismissive tone. "And this is my father-in-law, Martin Hale. He's retired now, lives modestly in Somerville." The words landed like a gavel. Retired, modest, Somerville. Brandon believed he had framed me perfectly, diminished me neatly for his boss's benefit. Elliot turned his head, his eyes finding mine. For a heartbeat, he saw only what Brandon had described. Then his gaze dropped, catching the glint of platinum at my cuff. His eyes widened, recognition flashing like lightning across his face. "Martin," he said, his voice rising with shock. "Martin Hale." The room stilled. Conversations faltered. Guests leaned closer, sensing something extraordinary unfolding. I extended my hand calmly. "Good to see you, Elliot. It's been too long." Elliot clasped my hand with both of his expression a mixture of disbelief and delight. "My God, what are you doing here?" Brandon blinked, his confidence crumbling. You know him." "Know him," Elliot barked, a laugh that carried across the room. "This man is my partner, co-founder of North Star Logic. Without him, there would be no company for you to sell at." Gasps rippled through the guests. Brandon's colleagues froze, their eyes wide, their admiration for him evaporating into stunned silence. Brandon's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, like a man drowning. His face drained of color, his hands trembling as he looked between us. And in that instant, the careful disguise I had worn for months fell away. The quiet retiree vanished. The truth stood in his place. Silence has a strange texture when it descends on a crowded room. In that banquet hall, it fell like a heavy velvet curtain, muffling conversations, freezing gestures, bending the air itself. One moment, laughter and clinking glasses filled the space. The next, all eyes turned toward me, and the quiet felt almost physical. Elliot still held my hand, gripping it with the kind of warmth only decades of battle-forged partnership can bring. His face shone with something between astonishment and pride, his voice carrying across the room as he repeated my name. Martin Hale, my partner, my friend. The words hung there undeniable, and I could feel the weight of them crushing down on Brandon. His polished image, carefully built and rehearsed for months, cracked like glass struck by a hammer. He stood stiffly beside Emily, his mouth opening and closing without sound, the practiced bravado leaking out of him in silence. Around us, Brandon's colleagues from North Star exchanged looks of shock. They knew me now, even if they had never met me before. They knew my name, my place in the company's history, the patents and articles that bore my signature. Some of them had walked past my portrait in the headquarters lobby 100 times, never imagining they'd just seen me introduced as a modest retiree living quietly in Somerville. Brandon's boss had just called me partner. And in that moment, he realized what it meant. Every smug comment he had made, every lesson he had tried to teach me, every word of pitying advice, recorded not in writing, but in memory. And now, in front of his peers, his mentor, and his new wife, the truth was exposed. Emily's hand tightened on his arm. I saw her eyes flick to mine, wide with fear, sadness, and a strange kind of relief. She had carried this secret with me, heavy and awkward, waiting for the moment it would break. Now it had. Elliot released my hand only to clap me on the shoulder. You vanished into retirement and left me with the mess, he said, his voice booming with affection. I should be angry, but today I'm only glad to see you here. At your daughter's wedding, no less. Wouldn't miss it, I said softly. Brandon tried to gather himself. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke. Mr. Raines, there must be some mistake. This is Emily's father. He's not. Not what Elliot cut in sharply. Not a man. Not a founder. Not the reason you even have a job at North Star. His eyes narrowed. What exactly were you about to say? Brandon stammered, I didn't know. He never told me. Elliot's gaze hardened. He didn't need to tell you. Respect shouldn't require a resume. The words struck deeper than any blow. I saw Brandon flinch, his face tightening as though the air itself had turned against him. His carefully styled hair, his expensive tuxedo, his posture, none of it mattered now. He was a boy, caught lying, stripped of authority, exposed in his own arrogance. Guests began whispering, the sound rising like wind through dry leaves. They weren't whispering about me, they were whispering about him. About the man who had just introduced his boss's business partner as an unemployed retiree. About the arrogance of youth and the blindness of ambition. About character. Elliot looked back at me, his voice lowering but still audible to those nearby. You've been watching him, haven't you? I have, I admitted, and I've been listening. Emily's face flushed, tears glimmering at the edges of her eyes. She squeezed Brandon's arm again, but this time it was less reassurance and more a plea, hold yourself together. Brandon looked at her helplessly, as though she could pull him from the quicksand he had stepped into himself. I reached into my inside pocket and withdrew the envelope containing the certified check. I held it loosely, letting it rest in my hand where all could see the embossed bank seal. This is my wedding gift to Emily and Brandon, I said. $75,000. A token of love for my daughter and a reminder that sometimes the simplest-looking man at the table carries more weight than appearances suggest. Gasps rippled again through the crowd. Brandon's colleagues stared openly now, their admiration curdled into disbelief. Emily covered her mouth, overwhelmed, torn between pride in her father and pain for her husband. Brandon's face drained of color. The same man who had dismissed me over soup at the Harbor View Bistro, who had waved his hand and spoken of budgets, now looked as though the ground beneath him had given way. Elliot turned to him. His voice was cold steel. Brandon, I want you to explain to me right now how you have been treating my business partner these last 4 months. The ballroom had gone so quiet that I could hear the faint clink of silverware being set down at a distant table. Brandon swallowed his Adam's apple jerking in his throat. I didn't know, he whispered again. I thought. You thought Elliot interrupted, that he was beneath you, and that was enough for you. I let the silence stretch, watching Brandon shrink beneath it. His arrogance had collapsed, but what remained was what mattered. Would he learn? Would he grow? Or would he cling to excuses? I thought of Emily then, of her words in the garden. Promise me you're not doing this just for revenge. She stood now between two futures, one with a husband humbled into growth, or one with a man broken by his own pride. I had forced the choice into the open, but she would live with the outcome. Elliot's voice carried again, crisp and final. On Monday morning, we'll be having a serious conversation about your future at North Star. Consider this your first and only warning. And thank your father-in-law that you even have that. The room exhaled. Guests began to murmur again, though now the tone had shifted curiosity, relief, fascination. Brandon swayed slightly as though the weight of his tuxedo was suddenly too much for him. Emily's hand steadied him, but her eyes never left mine. I inclined my head to her, a silent message. The lesson is done. What you choose from here is yours. The music resumed softly in the background. Waiters moved again, filling glasses, restoring order, but nothing in that room would ever be quite the same. Brandon Carter had just discovered the cost of assumptions, and the bill had been delivered in front of everyone who mattered. The reception hall had regained its rhythm. On the surface, music, clinking glasses, polite laughter, but beneath it all ran a current of unease. Eyes darted toward Brandon wherever he moved, some with pity, most with the sharp curiosity of people who know they've just witnessed something historic. He stood like a man trying to keep his footing on shifting sand, smile plastered but hollow gestures, stiff his charm leaking away with every passing second. Elliot kept close to me, the way a general stays beside his most trusted officer in battle. He was genial, with guests offering warm congratulations to Emily, but I saw the way his gaze flicked toward Brandon again and again, appraising, judging. The young man who had once seemed like a promising star in his sales department now looked like a liability. Emily clung to Brandon's arm, her smile stretched thin, her eyes shining with a mix of relief and dread. I knew she was replaying every moment of the past few months, every condescending comment, every awkward silence, every attempt she made to smooth over his arrogance. Now all of it had been dragged into the open. At one point, Brandon drifted toward me, moving stiffly like a soldier reporting for punishment. He cleared his throat, words barely forming. Mr. Hale. Martin. I held up a hand. Not now. Not in whispers. You owe this room more than that. His face tightened, but he nodded understanding. It didn't take long for Elliot to seize the moment. He tapped his glass, the sharp chime silencing the hall once more. If you'll indulge me, he said, his voice carrying the authority of decades in boardrooms, I'd like to say a few words. All attention turned to him. Brandon's shoulders slumped, bracing for impact. Today, Elliot began. We celebrate Emily and Brandon, their union, their future. But in celebrating, we are also reminded of the values that bind not just families, but companies, communities, and lives. Respect, integrity, character. He paused, letting the words settle. Some of you witnessed a revelation earlier. You saw my surprise when I recognized Martin Hale not as a stranger, not as a modest retiree, but as my partner, the man with whom I built North Star Logic. For decades, we labored side by side, unseen, often doubted, sometimes dismissed. What we created was not luck. It was persistence. It was sacrifice. It was trust. The guests leaned in, drawn to the cadence of his voice. He shifted his gaze deliberately toward Brandon. Respect is not conditional on a resume or a paycheck or the cut of a suit. It is owed to every person until they prove unworthy of it. That lesson, it seems, needs to be relearned from time to time. Brandon's face burned crimson, his jaw working as though he wanted to speak, but knew better. Emily squeezed his hand, her knuckles white. Elliot raised his glass. To Emily and Brandon, may your marriage be built not on appearances, but on substance. The room echoed the toast, though the words caught in some throats heavy with implication. When the clinking died down, I rose slowly, the envelope with the check still in my hand. I'd like to add something, I said, my voice calm but deliberate. All eyes shifted to me. Brandon looked at me as though waiting for an executioner's blade. Emily looked as if she might cry. I have lived long enough to know that wealth and success are illusions if they are not paired with humility. I have been called lucky, outdated, even deadweight. And perhaps I let those words pass without defense because I wanted to see the character behind them. What I saw was arrogance, but I also see now a chance for change. I turned to Brandon, my gaze steady. You owe me an apology, yes. But more than that, you owe my daughter a promise that you will never again measure people by the size of their bank accounts or the shine of their clothes, that you will see worth where it truly lies in kindness, in honesty, and perseverance. His mouth trembled. I understand. I promise. I'm sorry, Martin. Truly. The words were clumsy, thick with desperation, but I caught a glimmer in his eyes, remorse perhaps real for the first time. I extended the envelope, placing it in Emily's hands rather than his. This is for both of you, $75,000. Not to buy forgiveness, not to prove anything, but to give my daughter the start she deserves, whatever future she chooses. Gasps fluttered again through the room. Emily's lips parted, her hands shaking as she clutched the envelope. Tears welled in her eyes. Brandon's breath came shallow, his pride shredded. He looked from the envelope to me, then to Elliot, who still watched him with the sharp gaze of a hawk. Elliot broke the silence. Brandon, on Monday morning, will meet with Human Resources. Consider yourself on probation. 6 months. If you demonstrate humility, growth, and genuine respect, you may keep your position. If not, you're finished at North Star. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Brandon whispered, his voice barely audible. The humiliation was complete, yet the mercy was real. I had stayed the blade. His career still dangled, but by a thread of his own making. The reception stirred again cautiously as music resumed and waiters moved among tables. Conversations picked up, though now they buzzed with analysis, with the retelling of what they had just seen. Brandon had been dismantled publicly, yet not destroyed. I sat back in my chair, weary but steady. Emily leaned into me, whispering, "Thank you." I kissed her temple. "All I want is for you to be happy." Across the room, Brandon moved stiffly, shaking hands, forcing smiles. He looked diminished, but also chastened, the sharp arrogance replaced by something closer to humility. Whether it would last, only time would tell. But for the first time in months, I felt the weight ease from my shoulders. The lesson had been delivered. What Brandon did with it was his choice. And Emily, she had seen everything. There would be no illusions left. Weddings are supposed to blur into celebration music, dancing toasts that run long but are forgotten by morning. But ours didn't blur. It crystallized. Everything that happened after Elliot's words carried the sharp clarity of glass. Every laugh was measured, every glance weighed. It was as though the reception had turned into an unspoken tribunal, with Brandon standing at its center. I stayed near Emily for much of the evening. She greeted relatives, hugged friends, smiled for photographs. But behind her eyes was the storm, and I could see her navigating it. She had just watched the man she loved stripped bare in front of everyone who mattered. She also saw the man who raised her reveal himself in ways she never fully grasped. The collision of those truths was heavy, but she bore it with quiet grace. Brandon, on the other hand, moved through the hall like a shadow of himself. The man who once commanded rooms with endless chatter now spoke sparingly, each word, measured each handshake limp. His colleagues avoided him, their earlier admiration replaced by polite distance. They had seen his mask slip, and once seen it could not be unseen. Later in the evening, after the cake had been cut and the first dances danced, Brandon approached me. His tuxedo looked less sharp than it had that morning. His posture slumped, his smile brittle. He waited until Emily was across the room, then leaned close enough that I could smell the faint bitterness of champagne on his breath. "I know I can't undo what I said," he began, voice raw, "but I meant what I promised earlier. I'll do better. For her, for myself." I studied him in silence. He looked young again, not in years, but in vulnerability. Gone was the self-assured salesman. In his place stood a man who had just discovered how fragile ambition could be when built on arrogance. "You'll have to prove that I said it last. Not to me, to Emily, to Elliot, to everyone you dismissed when you thought you were above them." He nodded quickly, almost desperately. "I will, I swear it." The desperation in his eyes told me he finally understood the stakes. The rest of the evening passed quietly. Emily and Brandon left for their suite at the pavilion, while guests drifted back to their hotels. I walked alone down to the edge of the water. The tide was out, leaving wet sand that glistened in the moonlight. I stood there for a long while, the envelope with the bank's seal still heavy in my pocket, though Emily already knew it was hers. The ocean whispered the truth back at me, storms clear the air. The chaos of the day had broken something open, but in breaking, it had made room for rebuilding. In the weeks that followed, the consequences began to unfold. Elliot called me twice, his voice sharp, with the satisfaction of a man finally free to act on what he had long suspected. He's on probation, he told me. 6 months. Every move he makes will be measured. If he slips, he's finished. But I'll say this, he's quieter now. More careful. Maybe it's stuck. Emily, too, began to see the shift. She called me often sometimes to share updates, sometimes just to process. He's humbled, Dad, she said once. He thanks the waitstaff now. He doesn't interrupt people as much. I can tell he's trying. I heard the cautious hope in her voice, and it comforted me. She wanted her marriage to succeed, but she wasn't blind anymore. She watched him with clearer eyes. Brandon even came to visit me one Saturday alone. He stood awkwardly in my garden, staring at the tomato plants that had grown tall and heavy with fruit since the day Emily confronted me there. He admitted he didn't know the first thing about tending plants, but he asked questions anyway about soil and watering and patience. For the first time, he seemed willing to listen without performing. We sat on the bench beneath the maple tree, the same one where I'd explained to Emily why I was holding back the truth. Brandon's voice broke as he admitted how ashamed he felt, how foolish, how close he'd come to losing not just his career, but Emily's trust. He asked me what he could do to make things right. Respect people, I told him simply. Not their titles, not their clothes. Them. He nodded, tears brimming. I will, I promise. It wasn't redemption yet. Promises are easy, but I could see the seed planted. Whether it would grow depended on him. 3 months later, I met Elliot in Boston for lunch. He looked energized, his voice carrying that old spark. You'll like this, he said. Brandon has been different. More collaborative, less showmanship. He's even credited senior staff in meetings. It's almost like he learned something. I smiled faintly. Almost. Elliot leaned forward. You could come back, you know, even part-time. North Star could use your steadiness, your perspective. I shook my head. I've played my part. My legacy isn't just the company, it's the lesson we pass on. Sometimes a single lesson is more valuable than all the profits in the world. Elliot laughed, raising his glass. Spoken like a man who finally found peace. Maybe I had, or maybe peace was too strong a word, but I knew I had done what I needed to do for Emily, for myself, for the company we had built. That fall, Emily and Brandon invited me for dinner at their apartment. The air was crisp, the trees blazing red and gold. When I walked in, I was surprised to find Brandon cooking. He fumbled with pans, burned the sauce, and apologized too many times. But he tried. At the table, he raised his glass awkwardly. To second chances, he said, and to learning the hard way. Emily smiled at him, then at me. I caught her expression, cautious but hopeful. She hadn't forgiven everything, not yet, but she was giving him the space to prove himself. I lifted my own glass, to lessons that last. As we ate, laughter came more easily, conversation more balanced. Brandon still had edges, but they were softer. The arrogance had not vanished completely, but humility had begun to anchor it. When I left that evening, Emily hugged me tightly at the door. Thank you, Dad, she whispered. For the first time, I let myself believe the storm had done its work. In the quiet of my own home, I returned often to the study. The incorporation papers, the photographs, the awards, they still lined the walls, silent witnesses to the journey. But my eyes always settled on the photo from that first cramped garage. 2 young men with too much hope and too little money, daring to change the world. We had succeeded, not just in business, but in proving that persistence, integrity, and humility outlast the arrogance of fleeting ambition. Brandon had learned, Emily had seen, and I had found peace in knowing I'd given them both the gift of truth. Life has a way of settling after storms, the same way a sea grows calm once the wind has passed. But even in calm waters, the memory of the storm lingers. That is how the months after Emily's wedding felt quiet, ordinary on the surface, yet humming with the memory of what had happened under the chandeliers of the cliffside pavilion. For Emily, life shifted into the rhythm of early marriage. She and Brandon found an apartment in Cambridge, close enough to his office and not far from me. She came by often, sometimes alone, sometimes with him. I could tell she was still testing her new husband, watching him carefully, measuring his words against the promises he had made in that reception hall. Her smile was gentler now, more thoughtful, as though she no longer saw marriage as the perfect picture she had once imagined, but as a canvas still being painted. For Brandon, the storm left marks he could not hide. At North Star, Elliot kept him on a short leash. His 6-month probation was no empty threat. Colleagues who once admired his swagger now treated him with cautious courtesy, waiting to see if the arrogance would resurface. To his credit, he seemed to learn. Reports filtered back to me through Elliot and others he spoke less in meetings, listened more, gave credit where he had once seized it. He began mentoring a junior associate, something he would have dismissed as a waste of time months earlier. Whether out of genuine change or pure survival, the effect was the same. He was quieter, humbler, more deliberate. I did not see him often in those early months. When I did, it was usually at Emily's side. He still carried the nervous energy of a man who knows he stands on fragile ground. He avoided bragging, avoided commentary on my habits or home, avoided the old smug tone that had once laced every conversation. Instead, he asked small questions about my garden, about books I was reading, about the Red Sox. Simple things, but things he had never asked before. I answered without judgment, letting him find his footing. Change must grow, not be forced. One Saturday in late September, Brandon arrived at my house alone. He stood in the doorway holding a basket of tomatoes from Emily's garden, awkward but earnest. "I thought you might like these," he said, shifting from foot to foot. We sat in the backyard, the maple above us shedding early leaves. He spoke haltingly, admitting his shame, his fear, his gratitude that I had not ended his career with a single word. He said he knew he had a lifetime of work ahead to prove he was worthy of Emily, worthy of the second chance he had been given. I listened. I told him the truth. Respect cannot be demanded, only demonstrated. He nodded, his eyes wet, and promised again that he would keep trying. I believed him at least enough to let him try. Meanwhile, Elliot never stopped pushing me to return. He called every few weeks, insisting North Star needed my steady hand. "You could walk back into the boardroom tomorrow and command more respect than anyone else," he said. "We're strong, but we miss your balance." I always gave the same answer. "Elliot, I've done my part. The company has you. My legacy is secure." He would grumble, but he understood. He knew my presence had already accomplished what it needed. Sometimes lessons don't require constant presence. They require a single decisive moment. By winter, Emily and Brandon invited me to their home for dinner. It was simple roast chicken, vegetables, wine from a bottle with no pretension. Brandon cooked most of it himself. He burned the potatoes, apologized 3 times, and laughed at his own clumsiness. It was a sound I hadn't heard before, light, self-deprecating, free of performance. At the table, Emily reached for his hand and smiled at me. Her eyes no longer carried the tension of a woman torn between 2 men. She had seen her husband at his worst and her father at his most deliberate. She knew the truth. And she had chosen to give him the space to grow. After dinner, Brandon raised his glass. His voice shook slightly, but he met my gaze. To second chances, to learning the hard way, and to having someone in your life who doesn't let you get away with being less than you should be. I clinked my glass against his. To lessons that last. Now, months later, I sit again in my study. The framed papers and photographs still line the walls. They remind me of what I built, of what Elliot and I created from nothing but conviction and long nights. But they also remind me of something else, that legacy isn't only about companies or patents. Legacy is about the people we shape, the lessons we leave behind, the truths that endure when appearances fail. Brandon Carter once dismissed me as an old man with nothing but hobbies to keep me occupied. He called people like me dead weight. He believed he could read character in a menu choice or a suit. But the truth revealed itself. Character shows when the mask slips, when the stage collapses, when you think no one important is watching. That is when respect either lives or dies. I don't know what Brandon will become. Perhaps he will stumble again. Perhaps arrogance will return. Or perhaps the lesson will hold, and he will grow into the man Emily hopes he can be. That choice belongs to him now. But I know this: he will never again forget the day his arrogance collided with truth in front of 100 witnesses. And Emily, she is wiser now. She has seen the cost of assumptions, the value of humility, and the strength of quiet truths. She will carry that wisdom into her marriage, into her life, into every choice ahead. That more than anything was the reason I held my silence for so long. As for me, I am content. I tend my garden, I read. I walk along the Charles when the weather is fair. I have no need to stand in boardrooms or chase titles. My life is quiet, but it is full. Full of lessons learned, of battles fought, of love given. The world may see me as a retiree in Somerville, modest, unremarkable. Let them. I know who I am, I know what I've built, and I know the value of patience, of silence, of timing. Storms pass, what remains is character, and that in the end is enough.